Hi, my name is Mary and I'm the designer behind Maiden Mary Designs. Today I'm going to show you how to sew the Haven dress. We have a few different design options. One of them is the ruffle sleeve that I'm wearing, and the second option is a classic T sleeve that you can see here. A few other optional additions is to add a gathered tier to the skirt, or as have here on the dress form, you can do it as one solid piece without the gathered tier at the hem. The dress is designed with all heirloom finishes so that you can sew the entire dress just with a straight stitch. We'll be finishing the edges with French seams and also with bias binding and a receiving tuck for the gathers. And if you're adding the optional pockets, those will be finished on the side seams with a zigzag stitch. This dress has two waist ties that are fully adjustable, and the lining underneath is an elastic sheared panel to make it nursing friendly and also very adaptable and adjustable for changing sizes. You can see it underneath here. It's very, very stretchy. And with the waist ties and the elastic shearing and very flowy skirt underneath, it is entirely designed to be adaptable to your body's changes throughout the week or day or month or year to year, to change with you through the seasons, so that when you make something that you really love, you can keep it and wear it for many years. This dress is designed for a height of 5 feet and 10 inches or 178 centimeters. So keep that in mind if you are wanting to adjust the length of the bodice so that the waist channels hit a bit higher on you, or if you're wanting to shorten the skirt so that it's not quite so long for the hem, it's very simple to do so as well. A few notes regarding the markings on the pattern. Around the arm side on the bodice, there is a dot on the front shirt and the back shirt, and that is to show the beginning and the end point for the ruffle. So you do not need to mark that if you are doing the T sleeve. Be sure to mark all of the notches also for the sleeves, as well as the placement for the button loops and buttons. And when you're marking the waist channels, I like to use a heat erase pen, which is what I will be showing in this video. However, we are going to be pressing the seams a lot, and so that will remove the pen markings, and so I just trace them back in. Another option is to use chalk if you're using a darker fabric. This dress is designed for a lightweight to mid-weight fabric. It's great for thrifted bed sheets. Both of these were made from thrifted materials. They're very soft, drapey cottons. You can also use cotton voile, cotton sateen. You can use a lightweight linen, as long as it is a woven non-stretch fabric. This pattern is pretty versatile for a variety of fabrics, as long as it is lightweight enough that the shirring will shrink up with the elastic. If it's too stiff, it might not elasticate quite as easily. And if you're using a much lighter weight fabric that is a little less opaque, it's very simple to add a lining to this dress. You can just sew it right into the inside of the dress at the waistline. After you have your fabric pre-washed and cut out, we're ready to get started with sewing, and I will show you the first step. Starting with the front bodice, we are going to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches on the top shoulder. So the first row of gathering stitches 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the raw edge of the fabric. And then at the end of the shoulder, I'm sinking the needle, rotating the fabric around the needle, and then sewing a parallel gathering stitch about 2 millimeters from the first one, or 1/8 of an inch, and then sewing a second row of gathering stitches about 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the first row, and pulling a long tail of thread so that all of my tails of thread are in the same spot. We want to be sure not to backstitch on either end so that we are able to gently pull the fabric over the thread and gather it. With the wrong sides together, we're going to match the front bodice to the back bodice at the shoulders. Using one thread from each of the rows, we're going to gently adjust the gathers over the stitches until the shoulder width of the front bodice matches the shoulder width of the back bodice. Pin the shoulders with wrong sides together. Adjust your stitch length back to your standard stitch setting. Then sew the shoulder seam with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to trim down the seam allowance in half to 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch wide. With wrong sides together, match up the side seams of the bodice and pin in place, then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim down the seam allowance to about 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch wide. Press the seam allowance to one side, careful not to iron away the waist channel linings as much as possible if you're using a heat erase pen. So I just try to kind of avoid those, and then I'll trace them back in after where I've missed, and I flip it over and iron again on the inside. And here I just try to stay as close to the edge as possible, and then pin and sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Change your stitch setting back to a longer stitch length. Then we're going to open up the shoulder seam, separating the front bodice from the back bodice, and sew close to the edge on the gathered side a gathering stitch. Here I rotated it and did it parallel on the opposite direction as well to have 2 rows of gathering stitches. And then we will adjust the gathers to match up to the back bodice. This time it doesn't take quite as much adjusting, and then we'll just make sure that that shoulder seam is nice and even, and we'll pin in place with right sides together this time, enclosing that raw edge. And we will sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you can adjust the gathers as you're sewing as well, just to make sure that they look cohesive and evenly spaced. Open up the shoulder seam and press the seam allowance toward the back bodice. Then we're going to pin the seam allowance in place. Then we're going to top stitch 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch from the seam line. Moving to the side seam, we're going to press the seam allowance toward the back bodice. Be careful not to iron away your pen markings, but if you do, I'm just going to trace back in those lines so that I still have them for later. Here we're going to start prepping the T-sleeve. If you are making the ruffle sleeve option, you can go ahead and fast forward to that portion of the video. Starting with the wrong side of the T-sleeve facing up, we're going to pre-press the hem. First, I'm just ironing the sleeve piece so that it's nice and smooth. Then fold the hem of the sleeve up 1 centimeter with wrong sides together and press. This is a curved hem, so just take it slowly. Fold in small sections and iron as you go. After ironing all the way across the hem, we're going to fold it a second time at 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch to enclose the raw edge. And again, do it in small sections, ironing as you go. Now unfold the pressed hem. Fold the T-sleeve in half, matching the short sides with the wrong sides together, and pin in place. Sew the side seam with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we are going to trim the seam allowance down to about half the width. Press the seam allowance toward the back side of the sleeve, which is marked by the 2 notches. Then turn the sleeve inside out and fold the side seam and press in place, pin, and then sew with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowance toward the back of the sleeve, which is marked by 2 notches. Then we are going to refold the pre-pressed hem and pin it in place. So here I'm pinning around until I get to the seam section that's kind of lost its fold. So I'm just going to fold it again and press it, then fold it again a second time, press it, and pin it in place so it's ready to sew the hem. Start at the seam of the underarm and edge stitch along the fold of the hem all the way around the hem. Take it slow and sink the needle when you run out of fabric to sew. Rotate the sleeve around the presser foot and continue sewing. Press the hem of the sleeve for a clean finish. Change the setting on your machine to an extra long stitch length and sew 2 rows of gathering stitches between the front notch and back notch on the sleeve. Sew the first row of gathering stitches about 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the raw edge of the fabric. Then sew the second parallel row of gathering stitches 2 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch next to the first row. Gently pull on the tails of thread to make very light gathers. We don't want these gathers to be visible in the finished garment. It is simply for setting the sleeve into the bodice. Turn the bodice inside out and with the sleeve right side out, place the sleeve inside of the armhole. Setting the sleeve with right sides together to the bodice, pin the sleeve first at the front notch, matching the single notch on the sleeve to the single notch on the shirt. Then match up the underarm seams and pin the double notch on the back of the sleeve to the double notch on the back of the bodice. To ease in the curve of the sleeve, we're going to just slowly pin across, adjusting the gathers as needed until the upper portion of the sleeve fits within the upper portion of the sleeve hole. Sew the sleeve in place with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Take this step slowly and adjust the fabric as you go, rotating it around the presser foot. As you adjust the fabric, sink the needle before moving the fabric so that the material underneath the presser foot won't shift. It's also helpful to make sure that the fabric on the bottom side isn't being pinched or folded at any point. So always check both sides of your fabric on the sleeve and on the bodice, making sure that it's lining up and is moving flat underneath the presser foot so there aren't any little small pinches or folds. Next, we're going to move on to preparing our bias binding. We're going to be creating 2 different widths of bias binding, and we'll be using quite a lot of both widths. The first will be cut at 4.5 centimeters or 1 3/4 inches wide, and we're going to be cutting this on the bias, meaning it's at a 45-degree angle from the selvage edge or the straight edge of the fabric. You have a few different options of fabric you can use to create your bias tape. I'm using a thin white cotton. The primary color of my fabric for my dress is white, but I don't have enough of the stripes fabric to cut out the remnants and create enough bias tape. And so I'm using just a simple cotton for my bias tape. You can do the same as well. The majority of our bias tape will not be visible from the outside of the garment, at least in this width of 4.5 centimeters or 1 3/4 inches. All of these will be used in the inside of the garment. When we move on to the narrower width of bias binding, that may be seen from the outside of the garment. So you would want to prioritize using your matching fabric for those. And that would be for the hem and the neck lining of the bodice, as well as the hem of the ruffle sleeve and the binding for the arm side of the ruffle sleeve, if that is the sleeve option that you are sewing. And while we are cutting our bias binding, we can also cut the waist ties. Those do not need to be cut on the bias. They're quite long pieces of fabric, and so you can absolutely do those on the grain, the cross grain, either way is fine. Those are going to be 4.5 centimeters or 1 3/4 inches wide as well, and you can find the links for those in the pattern booklet. Now for the fun part, we're going to piece together our bias tape. So here you can see I'm matching the 2 ends together at an angle to create a 90-degree angle. If you're using a pattern or 2-sided fabric, you want them to be right sides together. And notice in the corners, I have a little triangle hanging over the edge. That is going to be our seam allowance. It's very important that you have that extra bit on the end of it. So when you open it up and press it, the 2 pieces are aligned on the edges. Here I'm sewing the two pieces together at the little V where the two pieces meet, and then trim the small triangle off the end. Open it up just to make sure that the two edges are straight, and then we're going to repeat until all of our pieces are sewn together. Make sure that you are continuing to sew with right sides together and that all of the seams are on the same side with all of the seam allowances on the back side. Repeat until all bias tape has been sewn together. For the 4.5 centimeter or 1 3/4 inch wide bias tape, we're going to need enough to make 2 waist channels and then also to finish the arm side of the T-sleeve, if that is the sleeve option that you are doing, as well as the waist ties, which do not need to be cut on the bias, but we will need enough matching fabric for the lengths of the waist ties. Now we're going to press our bias tape, iron along until you get to the seams, and then finger press the seam allowance in 2 opposite directions and press it flat with the iron. Continue all the way across until you've pressed flat all of your bias tape. If you're using a bias tape maker tool, sometimes the seam allowances can kind of get stuck inside of the tool, so you have to pull it and then manually press it with your fingers to make sure that the folds on the sides are maintained at the same width, and then just press it with extra steam to make sure that it stays nice and flat. If you do not have a bias tape maker tool, do not worry, it is not necessary. You can use a seam gauge or a standard measuring tape to fold the side 1 centimeter, and you're going to press each side. I would recommend doing one side first, iron all the way across at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, and then repeat on the opposite side. Another technique is to use a pin on your ironing board and pin onto the fabric of the board at the width that you're creating the bias tape to be. So 4.5 centimeters minus 2 centimeters for the folds. You're going to want it at 2.5 centimeters wide, or about an inch.